Yeah, so we've received apologies from Councillor Hebb, Councillor Duffin and Karen Wheeler.
I'd now like to approve the meetings from 7th of September. Thank you. I haven't received any items of urgent business, so I can tick that one. Has anyone got any declarations of interest? Thank you, Jane.
Thank you. I've got a non-pecuniary interest in relation to item 6, which is corporate asset related savings. The nature of that interest is that I indirectly work and others.
That's nothing that shouldn't affect anything that we're discussing. Lovely, thank you. Noted that, Lucy.
Yeah, that's all noted.
Right, item 5, medium-term financial strategy and budget proposals, page 15 to 28.
Thank you, Chair. So this report comes to overview and scrutiny in way of an update of the progress that's been made on the budget gap. There have been previous reports, certainly over the last 18 months, demonstrating the challenges that the council was going to be facing over the coming years. The reports, 2 main reports that have gone to Cabinet this year were in July and September. And further reports will be going there in December on certain savings proposals, which we'll come to in the body of the report, before the draft budget is considered by Cabinet in January, and then that draft budget will come back to the committee in January for further scrutiny before going on to Cabinet and Council. I'll just highlight a few of the points within the body of the report, and then obviously happy to take any questions. So the most recent position presented to Cabinet has shown that over the next 2 years there was a gross budget pressure of 34 million, and a number of actions have been brought forward to reduce that down, which brings us to about 3.9 million as we currently sit here now for those 2 years. And we'll touch on some of the detail of that as we go through. Section 2 of the report talks about the council's financial base. We've talked many times over many years that the council has one of the lowest council taxes of all unitary authorities in the country. We're about the 3rd lowest. When you consider that Windsor and Maidenhead are one of the lower ones, you've then got to look at the other side of the multiplier, which is the amount of band Ds we've got and the bands that all of our properties are in. And actually 70% of our properties in Thurrock are bands A to C. So they don't even raise that level of council tax, which is the 3rd lowest. So we've always been on a low council tax base. And you can also see, as in way of an example, in the 4th bullet point there, that Southend, actually raise an additional £15 million in council tax over and above what Thurrock Council is able to. And finally, those bullet points, although we collect £120 million of business rates in any normal year, that has been impacted by COVID, we only get to keep in the region of 30% of that sum, with the rest going into government and being redistributed. The SIP for Resilience Index, I found that a really useful indicator, or one part of it, a really useful indicator to show just actually how low our base is. One of the ways the SIP for Resilience Index works is it will have a horizontal line with a midpoint, and it will judge any council to the left of that midpoint, which is that indicator shows the council is at risk, or to the right, which means it's at less risk. Now, in adult social care, I think we've spoken many times before that we are, through national benchmarking, one of the lowest spenders of adult social care in the country. And yet, if you look at the SIP Resilience Index on adult social care costs as a percentage of the council's entire budget against other councils, we are actually one of the ones at risk. So we've got a very low spend, but because it's as a percentage of the budget, which is low, it shows that that is a high risk. Next thing I wanted to just touch on briefly, it's still very unclear as to the impact on us, is the comprehensive spending review, which was announced towards the end of October. The Chancellor announced actually real terms increases of 3.4% across local government, but that is judged on a rebased position of all local government for this year. So, for instance, the council received £4.5 million worth of COVID-related grants specifically for this year. The government take that off to create a new base, and then say it's going to be 3.4% above that on average across the country. We will need to wait. We're being told probably, at best guess, that there will be the announcements detailing the impacts on each local authority around about the 15th of December. So it's always, for many years now, been about the week before Christmas before we fully know the implications and impacts to us. In addition, whilst that is seen as a 3-year settlement, what we're clear on now in terms of conversations with Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities, DLUC, is that is a 3-year settlement for the local government as a whole, but the distribution methodology may well change next year. And so whatever we are told in December this year, we can't then use that as a benchmark for what we might receive the following year. We might get more, we might get less, we might get the same. So it creates further uncertainty. Council tax was announced, then retaining the cap, referendum cap at 1.99%, which is how we've been modelling our budget figures. But they have announced an additional 1% adult social care preset as being possible, and that is obviously for councillors to vote on in February at the main council meeting. I think I just want to touch on the national insurance side of things as well. The government obviously announced earlier in the summer about an increase in national insurance contributions across the country, and that would be going towards partly the NHS, but also partly towards the cost of social care. On the face of that, that looks good news, that the council is going to be given further funding for social care, but what's also clear is that that is only coming to fund the changes that are being made to the rules for social care. It is not coming to actually support the current position that councils are facing under the current rules, and there is significant pressure in both adults and children's social care at the moment. And in addition, as set out in 2.7, the council itself is going to have to pay additional national insurance contributions as well, just like any other company. And we estimate that's going to be anywhere between £900,000 and £1 million. So what we also know is when we look at that 3.4% real term increase, the government say that councils will be reimbursed for that additional cost of the 1% increase in national insurance, but we're also told that's coming out of the additional grant that they're giving us. So that's already a charge on any increased money that we receive. Next thing sort of wanted to touch on in here, if I come down to section 3 and 3.2, is main changes to the budget. Why have we got a £34 million budget gap over the next 2 years? We have assumed council tax increases of 2%. We now know that we may get 1% additional, but we also know there are significant pressures within adult social care already, as well as children's social care. We've also, so when we look at the core funding aspect, we've got increases in there totaling 1.7 million over the next 2 years, and that's because there are other reductions already within there because of what we call the collection fund deficit, where we've not been able to collect so much in more recent times, and also reductions in government grants that have come in this year to be able to support our council tax position. We then got increases for pay awards, other increments and other inflation, for instance on waste disposal contracts, utilities and fuel, and I'm sure everyone has seen the rising cost of inflation and cost of goods increasing as well. Treasury is in there with one of the more significant increases. Number of reasons fall under Treasury. It is the phasing out of maturing investments, which will, although that will have a reduction in interest payable, it has a larger reduction in interest receivable or the income side of things. There are increased interest costs linked to basically, first of all, the cost of borrowing in general terms on existing debt, but also in terms of the increased debt that we're incurring for capital programme, and increased MRP, that's the minimum revenue provision, which is largely set aside for principal repayments for debt, or consider it as depreciation if you want to look at it from a private sector position. And that again funds the capital programme that the council incurs. There's monies in there for social care and other growth. I have got concerns over whether those are high enough. And that's why if we did go for a 3% increase, that money would be ring-fenced for additional growth in those areas, or that would certainly be my recommendation. Other pressures are the removal of the COVID grant, because these are all changes year on year that we're talking about. So if you work on the basis that this year is balanced and it includes £4.8 million worth of one-off grant, then that comes out. It's no longer available for next year. And again, we took an approach this year of using reserves and capital receipts for transformational purposes, and we need to reduce that over the 2-year period, because that is not a sustainable way of balancing your budget. We did it because of the impact of COVID and those other challenges that we were facing. So they're being phased out so that in 23-24 there is no planned use of reserves or capital receipts, but there will be a lesser amount in next financial year. So bringing all of those together, that's when you get that overall challenge of £34 million over the next 2 years. The approach of looking at this, we can look at it, and we obviously do, that's officers and members alike, look at individual services in their own right. So you could look at libraries, you could look at social care, for instance, and those sort of challenges. But we were finding it really difficult to plough into those particular areas and identify savings large enough when you're thinking about 34 million. So we took the approach, and I've reported this to this committee before, about looking at it in a way that we call subjective budgets. So rather than saying, right, it's that director or it's that particular type of service like sports and leisure or whatever, it's those areas where you spend money and in a more general sense. So the subjective is employee expenses, for instance, it's premises costs, it's third-party payments, it's contracts, and so on. And when we look at those, we've only got in the region of about 16 subjective budgets in excess of £1 million. Now, I've targeted £1 million because we're trying to find 34 million. We've got plenty of other budgets, you know, much less than £1 million. Looking at those, and I've touched on some of them over 4.6 and 4.7. The largest by far is employee-related costs in the region of 100 million. We then came down to the cost of adult social care placements at 40 million. That's the gross cost of placements. Obviously, there are contributions towards those. Children's social care at 30 million. We were then on interest payable at 16 million. And then we had MRP at 9 million. So 9 million MRP you can't touch. That's governed by the way of statute in terms of how we can measure that. There's very little flexibility in that. What flexibility there has been, we've used in the past on 2 or 3 occasions in the last decade. We can't do any more on that. Interest is obviously high as well in terms of what we pay, but equally we are still budgeting in the region of £30 million worth of profits on investments. So to reduce that would require us to actually cash in investments, which are not always in our control, and actually we would reduce down our expenditure, but we would lose more income, and that would put a greater strain on the budget as things stand. But that's why when you're looking ahead, there are reductions coming as we phase out that income. Other budgets over £1 million, linking with things like the concessionary fares scheme. That's a national scheme, something that we do not have control over. Home to school transport, which is on the list to be considered, but I think you as members all know how difficult dealing with home to school transport can be as well, especially in terms of making large savings. Assets, and we've got a paper on assets obviously coming through on the next item, is in the region of about 3 million and so on as well. So it made us target very much having to look when we had control of some of those budgets, very much around the employee related costs, and therefore target salary reductions. Salary reductions come from reductions in posts, but maybe also more capitalisation, being able to top slice grants when we're doing work for, I know, things like the Towns Funds levelling up as grants come through and so on. So it was a mix of reductions and also being able to capitalise where we can. So very much targeted there, and we were aiming in the region of about 20 million over the next 2 years, which on an average salary of 40,000 equates to 500 FTE. That's not necessarily, as I say, a total reduction of 500 FTE, because if we capitalise some of them, that takes some of that out. The other area we were looking at was assets. We targeted out of the 3 million or so, 1 million originally back in July. Various decisions were made, especially around libraries, for instance, and I'll touch on that in the next report, not to touch libraries during this budget or the life of this MTFS. So I've had to reduce down the targeted saving under assets to 850,000. That mainly comes from the closure of the Thameside complex. It also comes from the fact that we've did not renew the lease on the multi-storey car park. That was in the region of 84,000, and there have been other savings that we've made within various buildings operational as well. When we take all of those into consideration, and there's more detail set out in Appendix 1 and 2, then we come down to about £3.3 million for next year, and around about 500,000 for the following year. The following year is more difficult though, because most of the savings already identified certainly bring us down to 3.3 for next year, but there are still significant staffing savings, which will obviously have impacts on services and service provision to be identified for 23-24. Just briefly in terms of the appendices, Appendix 1 sets out, and this mirrors or largely mirrors the paper that was considered by Cabinet in July. So Appendix 1 are reports which are having to come back to Cabinet for decision after they've been to the ONSs. Assets are obviously here today in terms of the Thameside building certainly. Others have been to the various ONS meetings already or are due to go. And Cabinet will reconsider all of these in December, and I think 1 or 2 in January. Appendix 2 are savings that were all under directors' delegations and didn't need any further approvals, and officers are working on delivering those. So, Chair, I think that's as much as I was going to say in way of introduction. I think that's fairly long, but I needed to cover quite a few aspects.
Quite quick. Yes, thank you ever so much. I've just, before I open up to question, on page 23 there was a typo error where it had said Cabinet in September. It will be Cabinet in December.
Thank you, Chair. Actually, you just reminded me of something else which I need to touch on. I said this largely mirrored the paper in July. There were 1 or 2 changes since the paper in July. The main one, other than the assets being reduced from 1 million to 850,000, was the paper in July considered the introduction of charging for the collection of green garden waste. We've been told by our portfolio holders that will no longer be supported, and so that's been removed from this paper in those figures.
Thank you. Right. Committee, is there any questions anyone would like to ask? No? Oh, John. Okay.
All right. Okay. Yeah. I'm just Sean, thank you very much for your presentation. I'm looking at the savings proposal. Even though it's like, sorry, it's page 26.
Yeah.
Appendix 1.
Yes.
Appendix 1. Yeah, just something that jumped into my eyes is the you're proposing savings, which is I think 100K, 100,000 on the town centre cleansing. And I was just thinking that if you cut that, isn't there going to be problem in cleanliness in the town centre? That is an issue already that we know. But if you're cutting the front line, I mean the needed service for such amount of money? Is it worked out through?
There could well be, Councillor Canada. I know this has been reported or will be reported, if it hasn't been already. I think it has, to the relevant overview and scrutiny committee to be able to answer those questions. The majority of these savings we're obviously trying to limit and mitigate the impact on the public and the area as much as we can in any, but I don't think we can guarantee that there will not be any impact on the community with any of these savings, and that's the very nature of the size of the budget problem that we've got. I think the other thing I should have said, Chair, is that Thurrock Council isn't unique in this. All councils around the country are facing these same challenges. I met with unitary treasurers and the LGA on and DLUC on Friday, and very much the pressures coming through and savings required were no different from anywhere else in the country, really. And what is coming through more and more now, actually, in terms of pressures, is children's social care very much overtaking, and the pressures on that overtaking what has always been adult social care is the main header.
Can I just ask you, Sean, I've got you, which of the town centres, that says town centre Appendix?
Which town centres? That, I think that's still to be decided. It will be around frequency and so on, and that will be a decision for the relevant director with the portfolio holder.
Thank you. Okay. No more questions, John?
I'll just explore two areas, if I can, Sean. I'll start with staff costs. So the proposal is to save £20 million over the period on staff costs.
Yep.
You've already said that some of that will be capitalisation savings, are not necessarily staff costs, but it is an equivalent of around 500 full-time equivalent.
Yes, we worked on 500. We worked on an average on-costed salary of 40,000. So that's what we think.
So what's your estimate of how many job losses, how many cases that will actually equate to?
I think we've already. I've got to be careful around the definition of redundancy. So that's if you're talking about people actually in post losing their jobs. My rough estimate would be that that's going to be anywhere between 200 and 250 over the 2-year period. The reason why I say that is you make the post redundant of the person, of course, and we've obviously been holding vacant posts for quite some considerable time. We'll move into redeployment positions as well, so we're trying to protect employment and recruitment as much as we can as well. So they're the posts which will go, but in terms of people impacted, my estimate would be in the 200 to 250.
200 to 250. And difficult though it is, whereabouts do you think those jobs will? Let me ask a different question. How are officers going to find those posts? What's the process for identifying those posts?
So we're going through 2 or 3 different stages at first. Our first point is to try and do any of this with minimal impact and wanting to try and mitigate any impacts on the community, as we say. And so with that, we've got a number of transformation programs going. So for instance, there is one called the Digital Efficiency Review, which also includes the ability to bring in robotic process engineering, automation rather, not engineering. And over 2 million is set aside for that already, but we believe that will be higher. Now that goes across the board. We couldn't say where that is now. We're looking at a number of posts in the region of a couple of hundred posts across all directorates to identify those that could be supported through the Digital Efficiency Review, and then how many savings that actually creates. So that's one sort of process that we're doing, a more corporate approach, not targeting any one individual or any one particular department, but looking how we can replace by making something more efficient. The other side of things is largely, if I go to another extreme, there'll be other examples in between, is each director is having to look at all of its own establishments. I'm no different from anybody else. I'm having to look through where I might be able to make reductions, what the impact of those reductions are going to be. We'll all do that. We'll all take that into a directors board meeting, obviously in the first instance, before being able to come up with a conclusion and bring forward recommendations. But with that, that's obviously also going to have to come with any impact on service provision.
So nobody's safe.
I would say that there is no safe area.
If council's going to get 10 million out of salaries in the next financial year, it's reasonable to say that that process notice would have to be given by the 1st of January. So where are we? So where proposed process, and we've been running a number of restructuring consultations, which will lead to post reductions over the last 2 to 3 months with 3 unions, on the basis that that will complete by the end of this month. So when we actually come through to Cabinet in December, those consultations will have completed. And it was important that we needed to make sure they were complete, or this phase of reductions was still moving forward into the new year with others, which we're still developing, as we were just talking about, ready for later on into the next financial year. But certainly, yeah, posts and restructuring proposals will have finished in the next 2 to 3 weeks. Okay, so when will members get to see the detail of that? It's difficult for us to comment this evening, now knowing that you're almost at the end of the process. This is the first time we've had an opportunity to input this process.
I can't tell you exactly when and how we'll inform members of the impacts on that. That's a question I'm going to have to take away from Mr. Kent and get a response to.
Are we looking at making more than 20 employees?
Yes.
So not clear in the papers, have we issued the HR1 notice?
We've not issued notice because the consultation still haven't finished. I don't know what an HR1 is, so I'll use my language. We started the consultation with the unions a couple of months ago, as I say, and we are working towards the end of those by the end of this month. It will then be for the relevant officers running those restructures to determine the outcome of that. And then we might need to go through any particular recruitment process or selection process to be able to do that. I can't talk about the documentation, sorry.
No, that's fine. But that's the notice that has to be served in any organisations looking at 20 or more.
So in that case, we must have done that because we briefed the unions before we started any of the formal consultation.
And does the council have a reserve to fund redundancy costs, John, or will this be another charge to revenue?
We do have a reserve. It's not a reserve that was in place by the 31st of March 2020. There was a limited pay award in this particular financial year, but we had budgeted for a full pay award. So we have earmarked that funding to support any severance costs, any additional training costs for any form of redeployment, and also to be able to support any transformational activity in that area.
What's the size of that reserve?
It's in excess of £1 million.
Can I just briefly look at foreign investment? So there's growth, if I'm reading it properly, at 3.2 of around.
Sorry, which page are you on?
3.2.
So we're looking at growth of around 12.1 million over the next 2 years in Treasury. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. But there's not a lot of detail there to explain how that figure of 12,169,000 has been derived, or what the Treasury management policy is going to be going forward. Can you just flesh that out a little more?
I'd need to dig back and get those figures for you now. I can't answer that off the top of my head. So again, I'll respond to that outside of this meeting, Chair. In terms of what that means, in terms of the Treasury management policy, nobody knows what their policy is going to look like at the moment because CIPRA are working through a prudential code update and everybody's waiting on the outcome of that to see how it may or may not impact on people's policies and Treasury management strategies. The position we're in at the moment is that Thurrock Council has been clear that it is carrying out no new investments going forward. That's also a requirement of PWLB, as I think most of you are aware. And it's no longer something that's supported by government, whereas obviously a few years ago it certainly was. So the policy is now we will borrow for capital programme purposes. That capital programme could also include Thurrock Regeneration Limited, which is moving forward as well. So that's largely the borrowing requirements going forward now.
I'm just a bit concerned, Sean, that there is no detail explaining how those figures were arrived at.
There's no detail published, but I'm happy to flesh those out.
And just again, not in paper, you went through those kind of big blocks of spending, chunking it 40 million on 40 million adults, 30 million children. The next largest is paying the debt, isn't it? At 16 million.
The next largest was 16 million. I thought I had said that, honestly. I said interest payable of 16 million. I thought I did. Apologies if I didn't.
Sorry.
And then the next side of that was the £9 million or so, which was MRP, which is also the principal repayments link.
Thanks, Sean.
So, you said
Yep.
tonight, explaining results.
Certainly, Chairman.
I had one problem. I'm just going to ask. Already got the gaps that aren't filled, the vacant posts. When you're putting that into savings, you're already saving that money. So I can't get in my head that how that can be an ongoing saving, spending it in the first place. Vacancies there.
Yeah, we budget it because the actual posts are budgeted for. We keep them vacant, and so it's in this year. So if you were just looking at two posts, both at £50,000 each, for instance, this year, right, you've got a £100,000 budget. One of those becomes vacant this year. You've still got a £100,000 budget, even if you don't spend 100,000. So when we go into next year, we reduce it by one post. We've then only got a £50,000 budget next year. So it's matching the budget in 1 year to the budget the following year, not what we spend in 1 year compared to what we spend the following year.
Got that.
It's the change in budgets, and that's what the MTFS does. It shows on each line how the budget for that particular area changes year on year.
Lovely, thank you. And the other thing I was just going to ask you is you talked about £1 million for training to change people's skills, etc. Are we sure that's enough? Because, you can have a planner going to which is social circle, over to accountancy or whatever. How have you equated and got those figures to allow the retraining staff?
It wasn't planned on that. So the budgets that we had for the pay award this year, which didn't happen, was in excess of £1 million and a half. What we've done is we've kept that separate. We've not allocated that to services in terms of their pay because it's not needed. The pay awards weren't given. We've just held that amount. How much of that will go on training? How much of that will go on severance costs? We still don't know. We're still working through. It might be enough. It might not be enough. And if it's not enough, actually going back to Councillor Kent's question, then we would need to be finding that from elsewhere, such as one of the other reserves. If it is enough, then we'll roll that forward and carry on with that into future years.
James.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. First of all, the finance team should be congratulated. We've dropped down from about 34 down to about 3.9. That's circa 90% of the deficit, broadly speaking, identified. So the team should be congratulated for that. The MTFS is only going to last for a couple of years. Long term, it won't fundamentally, even if we balance the current MTFS, it won't fundamentally change the fact of the tax base being predominantly below band D. Obviously, hopefully, strategically, we'll use the local plan to address that problem going forward. The big thing it's not going to address is the fact that if you look at an area like Essex County Council, I think they still have about 10 times the amount of self-funders in adult social care than we do. So even with the national insurance increase being perhaps ported over to us in the main from the NHS after 3 years, it's not going to address the fact that we've got that demographic issue. Other authorities simply have more self-funders than us. the only prospect, bit like the local plan can deal with the tax-based problem, the only prospect of dealing with the adult social care issue would be some form of local government reform. So some type of settlement, whether that's expansion of unitary authorities, some type of devolution deal, I don't know. So can you just give us some reassurance that if Deluxe does kick off a conversation with regards to local government reform, we will adequately resource our thinking power and our response to that, because I don't see any other way to address the adult social care funding problem within the confines of our current geography.
There's a lot of questions there, and I'm not sure how many I can actually answer.
So yes,
yeah. Well, yeah, it's. I mean, in terms of reorganisation, that's a matter for members. It's not a matter for officers in terms of that. You know, and depending on instructions from members about what work they want done for this, then we will have to make sure that's resourced adequately as much as we can. What I do have to say is, you know, for the reasons that we will be reducing down staffing, that our capacity is going to continue to reduce. And I think we have to recognise that as well, as much as we will try and mitigate it through other measures. I struggle to see how any local authority, 3, 5, 7 years on current funding methodology is going to be able to continue. And let alone the fact that we're just on a low base, you know, unless there's a fundamental change to the way councils are funded. And that may come from local government reorganisation. I mean, for me, and again, for a lot of my other colleagues on the call on Friday with the Luck and unitary treasurers, you know, we were all talking about children's. You mentioned adult social care. Now, we've all known that's the problem. But actually, if you go back to the September report, which showed the first 3 months financial position for this year, children's was overspending by 1.8 million. And I'm worried that's getting worse at the moment. And every local authority is coming up with those issues.
But the reason I specifically reference adults is because the difference between adult social care and child social care is that by and large, adult social care money follows per head.
Yeah. Whereas
children's doesn't. So if you look at the economies of the adult social care system, looking at our current geography, without meaningful reform, we simply will never have the same spending power that an authority like Essex have. Nothing about local government reform will deal with the children's issue because the money doesn't follow per head.
No.
So that's why I'm saying that in the same way that we had to staff a bit of thinking power around getting the Freeport bid one, we will eventually need to seriously staff thinking power around local government reform, because it's all well and good saying that we've got to reduce of internal capacity, which is perfectly understandable, but fundamentally long term, I don't see a conclusion to the finances, the adult social care argument, unless we get meaningful local government reform, and that's serious, in-depth strategic thinking. And certainly some other authorities did roll out their thinking when it was mooted under the last Secretary of State, and I want to make sure that we are in a position to quite robustly put forward what it is we want, what it is economically we need.
I agree that when we come to that position, and I think local government will, I think that'll be from central government, that's a personal opinion, you know, obviously. We will have to put in whatever resources required to be able to do that, to be able to strengthen the position for the people of Thurrock, undoubtedly. What that's going to look like, I've no idea. But will we be doing our utmost in terms of being able to feed into those consultations, however they may look? Then the simple answer is yes.
So looking at page 16, the recommendations are 1.1, the committee note and comment on financial forecast included within this report, and that the committee consider the proposal set out in Appendix 1 on the Mr. Cabinet, Thurrock Council's. Are we all in agreement?
No, I mean, recommendation 1.1, note the comment, we've noted the comment, the opportunity to comment, which that's fine. But 1.2, the committee consider the proposal set out in Appendix 1. Why are we only asked to
So I don't understand.
The point is, there are savings proposals that are under director's delegation.
Which is 1.2, Appendix 2, yes.
Why are we being asked to comment? Still decisions that have to be due back.
But they are decisions that are always go to delegation.
Or may not be the case. You're now looking at the 34 million budget. When the whole budget of this council's that is a huge amount of money. We're being asked to comment on a tiny part of it. I don't think that's appropriate. I would also say that of those savings proposals there, all of them are the which is on assets, which we're talking about next, will have gone to other scrutiny. So I don't think that's a meaningful problem for this committee.
I don't have further recommendations.
Chair, I absolutely understand where Councillor Kent's coming from, and as soon as he raised that particular point on 1.2, yeah, I can accept that as the author of the report. I think we've got to be clear, and this is so it's totally my fault. We've got to be clear about what the role of this committee is. It isn't around the individual items which are under other scrutinies, but it has within the Constitution got the responsibility of the budget as a whole, and therefore the impact of the budget as a whole that's coming through. For me, thank you, Sarah. For me, I wouldn't have limited. I'm obviously going to take the minutes and the key questions and comments and so on that have been made throughout this and place that within the cabinet report that goes forward in December and January. So I would not have limited it to Appendix 1 anyway. So I just want to make that. I want to make that clear. I think personally, I think that's reasonable. And if I had my time again, I would have written the recommendation in a different way. So
Right,
apologies to me.
so we can get some agreement tonight. What shall we make it? We agree on 1.1. Yes.
I think, Chair, you can. I mean, others might have a view. You could probably just set out in Appendix 1 and it's consider the proposed within the report and be able to report that to cabinet. Now, there have obviously been concerns about the approach. For instance, there have been concerns about the number of staff, how we're going about identifying those, etc., which are all relevant comments for this committee, and will certainly be ones that I would be feeding back.
Yeah. So we'll take out 1.2, and we're going to agree 1.1.
I think what Sean is saying, I just remove the point that set out in Appendix 1.
Yeah, if you take out Appendix 1
yeah,
and replace it with the report, so that the committee consider the proposal set out in the report and provide comments to cabinet.
Okay. So we're all in agreement with that, John. You're happy with that wording?
yeah.
About you, John?
Tremendously important change.
Well, I think John's right in this case that it is a big amount of budget that we do need to look at. Right, so the proposals are the committee note and comment and forecast included within this report, and consider the proposals set out in this report and provide comments on to COP. Thank you. Agreed? Right, thank you. Right, moving on to item 6. This is again, here's the report by Sean, and it's to do with the related report on asset savings. I also have on this 2 speakers. I have a statement by Mr. Murray James, and I also have a question from Samantha Byrne. Okay, that's lovely. Mr. James, could I have your, you might come up and
It's up to you. You can either stand or if not, I can get you a chair. And... Thank you, John. Watch your feet and
So, thank you, Chair. I'm a member of Thurrock Yacht Club. Grays has been offered a once-in-a-generation opportunity to connect the town with its Thames foreshore through the £20 million town fund. This could unlock huge recreational potential on the river, potential that is also recognised by the Port of London Authority through its Active Thames programme, which aims to increase participation in recreational activity along the full length of the river. Our stretch of the Thames has some unique advantages for sailing in particular, but strong tides, deep mud and commercial shipping traffic means it's a challenging area for novices. A degree of both competence and confidence are required to enjoy our waters safely. Grays is a coastal town with a proud maritime history, and at Thurrock Yacht Club we firmly believe that we need to be putting a focus on maritime sports in an area that suffers from high levels of inactivity, a problem that members will know leads to a higher long-term demand on scarce council and NHS resources. Thurrock is fortunate that it already has a fantastic facility at Grange Waters. Following the winding down of sailing at Stubbers and Upminster, Grange Waters is now the only safe learning water within easy reach of Thurrock. It is also an ideal feeder site for other aquatic sports that can transfer to Thames, including paddle sports and rowing. Our club is currently working with the team at Grange Waters to establish regular recreational sailing activities that span both their site and our established sailing area in Grays on the waterfront. A joined up offer of this nature creates opportunity not only for the people of Thurrock, it will also attract people to come from surrounding areas to regularly enjoy leisure time in our wonderful borough and prove that we are more than just a place to shop. We urge this committee to do everything within their remit to ensure the full long-term financial impacts of disposing of Grange Waters are fully explored before any decisions are made, including its important role in ensuring the Grange Town Fund project does not leave Thurrock stranded with a new generation of unproductive public assets. Grange Waters is more than a cherished community asset. It is a vital enabler for bringing recreation to the Thames. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gunn. Just ask you, it has been listed. Aware of that process?
Yes, so we actually nominated the site for community asset. Just something I know from my professional life.
Okay. I don't usually ask questions of people. How many members?
So so with the demise of Stubbers, we're actually growing very rapidly at the moment. So we're currently sitting at around about 130 members. A lot of those come from Thurrock, but of course with Stubbers, the Stubbers clubs coming to us, it's increased our catchment area to include Havering, Brentwood and surrounding areas. So we're a bit of an attraction at the moment, which is good. We've inherited a number of club dinghies. So if you look down there now, you'll see a big line of dinghies lining the waterfront, and now they're for club use and making sailing accessible and affordable to the people of Grays. So yes, we're growing 130 this week, hopefully more next week.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Am I all right here, or do you want me to?
Well, yes, well, no, I think
You can't see me, can you?
I can't see you. I can't see you.
Okay, I've got a very short question here. And the report talks about the importance of arts and culture. Can you please explain how you can consider closing the Thameside complex that houses a theatre and museum before the elements of the new cultural strategy, details yet haven't been released, are successfully running in its place?
Thanks, Chair. I mean, this normally falls to officers to respond to overview and scrutiny without the relevant portfolio holder. So prepared a brief response earlier. So thank you for the question, Ms. Byrne. This is really directed at the Cabinet, who will be making the decision in December. So I wanted to confirm to yourself and to the committee that I will include this as part of the consultation with ONS in the Cabinet report, for members to consider when making their decision. This report already sets out what work is already taking place with interested parties, whilst in addition there has also been one roundtable meeting with community representation and another planned within the next couple of weeks. No matter what decision is taken by Cabinet in December, papers will be submitted to the relevant overview and scrutiny committee on the draft cultural strategy when completed. But the main point there is that the question needs to be put to the Cabinet, who will be making the actual decision, and I'll ensure that that is included as part of that report.
Got any more questions?
Yes, I have. Thank you, Madam Chair. My secondary question, I mean, I could follow on from my first question to say, so this would be discussed at the Cabinet meeting, because I mean, obviously you've mentioned there in that statement. I was present at the first roundtable meeting, which actually I believe took place in September at High House. And we were promised that there would be 2 or 3 members of the members of the community who were called to this roundtable meeting, and that there would be 2, 3, maybe even 4 of these roundtable meetings over a succession of maybe a gap of 2 weeks at a time, leading up to December, obviously with the Cabinet meeting where this subject is going to be discussed. We've only had one, which was the initial one, which was a little disorganised, unfortunately, which was a shame, a missed opportunity. And I did chase actually Karen Wheeler earlier in the week about the second one, because we still hadn't heard. The second one was planned, but unfortunately it was around the demise of Sir Amos, and yeah, and the meetings were cancelled, as were other council meetings that following week, of course, and totally understandable. So we did think that we would get a call for the following week. We didn't, and obviously that's maybe 3 or 4 or 5 weeks ago, I'm not sure. And then the next meeting is planned for the end of November. My biggest worry, and I think the worry of the community and the residents of Thurrock, is that there's been a lot of talk about how they're going out into the community and discussing the closure of the Thameside with the community and with the residents. We're now having a meeting on the 30th of November, which will be our second meeting and hopefully more productive than the last. And decisions are going to be made in December.
Where is it going to be held?
High House on the 30th of November. And I believe your next Cabinet meeting is the 8th of December.
It is, and the papers actually go out on the 30th of November for that Cabinet meeting.
So that really is quite concerning, I think, for a lot of the
It's quite
residents.
close, isn't it? So presumably you're going to have the meeting in the morning, give you time to...
No, the meeting's in the afternoon at 3 o'clock. I'm looking at it in my calendar right now. I wasn't at the first one, as has been already stated. The second one had been planned, so I can't comment. Sorry on the commitment. So I totally accept what you say. Because of that, because of the unfortunate death of Sir Amos, that one was postponed. I can't answer as to why it's taken so long. It's trying to the diaries, I'm guessing, between everybody else to be able to do that. That said, it's not just the question which I'll place back into the committee report for Cabinet. I'm happy to be raising all of those particular points at the time as well. And we'll certainly feed back on that as well at the actual Cabinet meeting week later.
Yeah, I think that needs to be done, because you could be going to full Cabinet the same day and write it. And I think, it's such an emotive subject that I do think the Republic should be involved in it.
Yeah. Sorry, can I just ask, my secondary question was, you state in the report that the issue is about the building, not the service. Can you tell me how the service will be funded and what plans you have in place to attract a credible income stream to 40,000 plus paying audience members that the theatre attracts each year? As surely without funds, no strategy can be implemented or survive.
I've got an answer, and it's probably the one that's expected, which is I have no answer to that particular point. That's going to depend exactly on what the council decides its cultural strategy and its offer towards the arts and the theatre is going to be. I can't answer that for the reasons why all those conversations are still taking place. The reason why I'm clear in the report about this being about the building and not the theatre is it's the building that falls under the remit of this particular committee. That said, in the same way as John Kent was pointing out in the last one, it's the wider implications as well, that we can't get away from, which is why I do talk about and needs to touch on the cultural strategy within the body of the report. But inside there is no plans at the moment while that cultural strategy is still being developed and still being gathered whilst having those discussions with people in the community, although not as much as you might.
Exactly, because obviously if you're having a meeting on the 30th of November where you're gathering information and you're engaging with the community, that meeting is a little bit
Yeah, I think,
because obviously decisions are going to be made on the 8th of December
And-
at cabinet meeting when you're not getting the full response. From
and what the
people
cabinet are
involved.
going to have to actually decide on that 8th is whether they've got enough traction and enough progress to actually inform that decision, and how much they want that decision to actually influence that decision.
And I think that's why I felt that it was very important to highlight those issues, because
That's
obviously,
brilliant. So can I give you my assurance that this will all be taken back to cabinet first to make sure? We will
Rachel's
look
in
at it.
into replies from Karen.
Yes.
Yeah, also, if they can do an earlier meeting than the 30th, be quite good. But whether all their diaries can go together, I cannot answer that. And as I say, the meaning is not the theatre, but the building.
oh, the
itself.
complex, and I'm not just talking, I mean, my questions were, but I'm talking about the
I
complex as a
understand.
whole,
I
absolutely.
understand. So thank you ever so much.
Thank
So-
you, Madam Chair, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Right, so, the report is on the asset related savings. So, item 6, and start on page 29. So, over to you, Sean.
So, Chair, I'm not looking to say too much in way of introduction on this, because I think the framework was actually set out on the last item around the budget and why the cost of assets. 3 particular areas of note within here, but one being the most sensitive, certainly for want of a better phrase. So the Thameside complex, there has been a lot of discussion about the capital cost, whether it's 16 million, whether the main focus that brought it to attention was more around the revenue costs. That's where the focus absolutely is. So in 3.3, we set out the outturn for 2021. So these were the actual figures of £601,970. And again, there is the budget there for 2021-22. And as we said on the last item, what we're looking at is the budgets and how we can affect the budgets, and that's at 629,000. And you can see the similarities in a number of those areas between the years. Obviously, utilities have gone up quite considerably because there was far more limited use last year. We do then move on to the breakdown of the 16 million. As I say, there are a number of questions about this, how accurate they are, who's done them. The majority have certainly been done from the likes of mechanical, electrical engineers and so on. The largest single item in theatre modernisation refurb, that actually came from a study done about 6 years ago, 5 or 6 years ago. So it could be very different, but all of those figures could quite easily flex. They could be less, they could be higher, I'm sure. What we do know is that there has been very little spent on the complex over a long period of time. So I've checked the capital programme as an example for the last 10 years. And there has been £300,000 spent on capital expenditure over 10 years on the Thameside, and 200,000 of that is actually in the first 2 years of those 10 years. So just 100,000 in the last 8 years, which demonstrates, I think, quite a lot in terms of the structure of the building. There is a few paragraphs there on the arts and cultural strategy, and Ms. Byrne has obviously just spoken about that and highlighted the concerns around the development of that, which will include in the report going forward. Other aspects in there we touch on around the library, that should the complex close to the ground floor of the civic offices. It had already been agreed that the registrar service would be facilitated in the civic office extension is 3. Because of changes required around that, for instance, the movement of the library, the complex would not close any time before the end of March. That is to say, it will be the end of March, but I can't see how. That also obviously depends on whether members decide to actually close the complex anyway. Grange waters we touched on, and Mr. James has made a statement on that again. I don't think I said it after Mr. James's statement, but again, that will be included in the report that I take forward in December to the Cabinet. There is no direct plans for Grange waters. It was identified by members back in July as an area that they wanted to examine, and is this the type of activity with reducing resources that the council should be continuing with going forward. That said, there is no immediate plans. I've said that in there that one area is development that's being explored, but if that was to happen, that is some way away yet, a good 3-4 years. And as such, the direction from portfolio holders is to keep Grange Waters open for the foreseeable future until such time as a firm decision is made. And finally, it hadn't actually been included in any previous reports, but I wanted to raise it just for the being clear that nothing was happening with libraries. It's another area which is obviously very emotive. It's the reason why I've changed the saving from £1 million down to 850,000, because we've taken out one whole suite of property related expenditure as being able to be effective. So libraries will, there's no plans for any changes to libraries over the life of this MTFS, certainly. Chair, I think that's all I want to say at this stage.
Well, I've got a question. So again, community assets. So how long ago did the local councils put the Thameside complex as a community
So the
asset?
Thameside complex has not been granted status for a community of asset value. There are two different phrases, and I'm going to try and make sure I get them right here. So Grange Waters, as Mr. James pointed out, there was an application that came in to make Grange Waters to classify it as a asset of community value. What that means is that should the council decide to dispose of the asset, that community organisation gets the first refusal, in effect, of whether they wish to purchase or take on that site, and there's a 6-month period for that. And that was granted once it went through the process of evaluation. There had been an application come in on the Thameside, but that needed to be returned for amendments to be made. I'm not aware that it's come back in yet, but it may have been.
I think it has, because I
It has,
did actually go to a meeting, and I believe that it has been resubmitted. Okay. So, but it would have been very recently, but it has gone through.
So,
Sean, so
thank
why
you.
don't I do me?
That's right. So can I finish that?
All right.
Sorry, if I finish that response. So that has come through. That will now need to go through a process to see whether it fits the criteria. That normally takes 3 to 4 weeks. Can be allocated into that status. The other issue, and this is where the wording is very similar, but it's two very different things, is a community asset transfer. And we have been approached by one community group to discuss with us the possibility of a community asset transfer, which would be transferring the asset, as it very much as it sounds in the phrase, to that community group. We do not know what that looks like yet. I have a meeting with that community group on Friday to understand what their proposals might be around that, and ultimately, again, that would be a member decision.
What I'm concerned about is obviously we've been talking about the Thameside complex for quite a few years now. Had not the local councils, I don't know who's ruled it before, had not already begun the process of putting it as a community asset. So this has only just come up.
As I can only answer on what I know is in front of me. It is not classed yet and hasn't been, to the best of my knowledge, as a community asset, as an asset of community value. It's certainly not on the current listings, and I haven't seen that it was in more recent years. So I can't answer what members may have been progressing, but I can say it doesn't appear to have ever been classified in that way.
No, and I think that's a great shame, and I think that's we need to all councils to look at their wards and see what should be going on the list and what shouldn't be. Right, open up to questions. Any questions from anyone? John?
Yeah, I mean, if I can just try and split it out into 2 different parts. So the target now has reduced from 1 million to 850,000. The proposal is that 600,000 of the 850 is from Thameside. that leaves us with a quarter of a million. If I look back to the Cabinet agenda in March and the Cabinet agenda in July, there were a number of assets that were listed there for sale. Can I just ask what progress has been made on those?
Yeah, for you, there were a number there which wouldn't have had revenue costs to them. So there were some sites on there for straightforward disposal. There were Grange Waters was obviously on there. Actually, Grange Waters has zero net cost to us. It largely breaks even, so revenue savings are limited. One of the issues for Grange Waters was more around, is that something that the council believes it should be doing going forward? And secondly, having to look ahead at probable investments and whether the council wanted to be able to invest in those areas. Another area, and it's one of the ones which is getting quite a lot of interest at the moment and concerns from residents, is Richmond Road and the what was the Thurrock Adult Community College. They've already moved. That site is being currently going through the process of demolition. We're going through the aspects at the moment of surveys and asbestos clearance on that site. That again, if we're looking at how that contributes towards the 850,000, everything including the building costs of the adult college were ring fenced for the college itself. So again, that creates no direct saving towards that £1 million. Others were smaller amounts. The larger amount of that 250, as I think I mentioned earlier, is actually reducing down the lease and not renewing the lease on the multi-storey car park in Grosvenor Centre.
Can I just ask you one point, as you say, that Grange Waters is zero, as it were, because it doesn't cost us. As taxpayers, if the Thames complex is as it is now, how much would that put on, what percentage would everyone rise on?
I mean, the easy way of looking at it is 1% equals about £700,000 on council tax. And we're looking at about £600,000 worth of revenue costs on the Thameside complex as things stand.
And then it'd be ongoing anyway.
And it's ongoing.
Yeah. Okay. Lovely. John, sorry, did you want a question?
Well, I want to come back to what I was talking about, which was anything apart from the Thameside, just look at that other 250,000. So Sean, for any asset disposal, you've got things such as legal costs. There's nothing in the report, and looking back to both July and March cabinet, there was nothing there. So just give us a view on what you think those costs will be and where they're being funded from. You've also got some of those assets are currently paying back to the council because they're being released, so there's an income. What's the calculation of income? And for some of those assets, we will still be paying off the loan that was taken to build them. So that will be first call on any income. So can you just give us a feel as to what all of that adds up to? What it means?
So the costs, in terms of legal costs, in terms of other disposal related costs, etc., can all be capitalised against any future capital receipts. So they'll be met from the future capital receipt that will come through. There are other budgets which we've already got for general demolition within the capital programme, so they'll be met through that aspect as well. In terms of where there is income coming through, if I look at the Thameside, as an example in 3.3, the 600,000 of income, the gross expenditure is actually higher, so the income from that area has already been considered. Where we look at other areas with income receipts as well, where there's not a net position, that would be taken into consideration against the overall saving of the revenue.
And on the same side, if we go to that table at 3.3, income outturn 2021 is significantly lower because of COVID, I say. So the full year would be around 50,000. So the 50,000, and that again is off the lettings within the building. That's not theatre income or rental income. Yeah, that's correct. So the full year that would be closer to 50,000.
that correct. That's what we've certainly budgeted. So that's what we'd expect.
That's helpful. So on the tech side, I mean, say it, I do some closing, which isn't the same to be run by the local. So if I was asking ST what would say to cabinet, I had a 362 where discussions are on about interest. We've already heard from Samantha in your conversation that the time scale for that is ridiculously tight. So I would be asking that we accept that we need to make that saving in the year, buy some time to allow those conversations and those negotiations to develop, hopefully come to satisfy one. So that, Jerry, is what.
So John, what is actual whole complex?
The whole complex, the whole complex. I mean, for many reasons, think that the idea of pushing the complex, pushing a buffer and sound to site building is the wrong. Ask if any estimations of carbon emissions that we're seeing across the piece now. Other authorities, other places turning to refurbishing building, carbon demolition building. One of those reasons is that's how we considered. But that
really to actually knock something down from the, is always better to refinish it when it is just I often wonder,
actually.
well it is, because we could argue, you and I, about that, but I also think to sorry, what did he say? I missed it, John. Sorry, I wasn't, because I have to lip read a bit.
You've just gone from always to often. We carry on and we'll get to sometimes. Sorry, carry on.
No, always. And also what I also think, to a certain degree, that why don't we have a totally new inside complex? Because what I think is it doesn't actually fit the needs of the residents as such, because you can't have large audiences. Not making, this is only my own presumption on this. If the library is dealing with the council building, etc., isn't this an opportunity to have something that is really, type of first class?
If what you're suggesting is that we put an alternative view to cabinet, which is the Thameside complex doesn't close until alternative provision is in place, then I would support that. Is that what you're proposing?
I'm not actually proposing that. I'm surmising that for people they would quite like something new and wow. So, with that. Sean, you had your hand up. Sorry.
Sorry, the conversation seems to have moved on a little bit since then.
Yes,
it was really just to actually be clear with the committee and Councillor Kent on something he just said. Really, there are currently no plans as to what will happen with that building or site moving forward. No plans have been put forward. I'm not working on anything, certainly, from that aspect. This is coming from the revenue challenges of the entire budget and the revenue cost of the Thameside complex. So it's not necessarily answering Councillor Kent. It's just being clear that at the moment there are no plans to demolish it. There are no plans to renovate it or anything like that. So when we go into the meeting with the community group on Friday, certainly going in with an absolute open mind.
So I would just repeat that what I would like to see played out, refer back to cabinet from this committee, is a plea that sufficient time is given to allow those conversations to reach maturity and give you a chance for an outcome that would please everyone. And if that means not making the full year savings, then it means not making savings.
I don't think that it's going to be such a good idea, and I think we need to vote on that, because I do understand from what Ms. Byrne said about meetings, but I think this is dragged on for so long now, and that need to begin making decisions. What those decisions were was me to surmise, and also with all what was said will be reported back to Councillor. Councillor Howden.
Sorry, are you done?
No.
Well, I would just, yeah.
So can I just, and it's me being finicky, so table 3.5.
Hang on, 3.5. Yeah.
It's just me being pedantic, but the figures don't add up. So when you get to the subtotal, you've got that listed as 15,556,000. It's actually 13,931,000. Can I just ask how that's happened?
No, I can see it. It's when we've been transferring tables across. If you, the figure that you've just said, I'm doing this quickly in my head with the figure that I think you just gave. If you then add that 1.6 million onto your 13 million that you talk about, and then the 750, that's when you get to the 16,352.
Yeah, absolutely. You start from where
so the subtotal is the figure that's wrong.
Yes, the subtotal figure is wrong. Is that just an adding up error, or has something been added or removed?
No, I think I can check back on all of the previous source documents. I think that's how we've copied it across into a Word table.
Okay.
Thanks, Chair. But first of all, I really welcome the fact we've actually had public questions and a public statement. 11.5 years as a council, we don't get a huge amount, so it is actually genuinely welcome to have people come and join us. The thing I'm quite taken by this report is the commentary. I know there's some dispute around 16 million cost to refurbish the current town side, but that 16 million, Sean, unless I'm incorrect, that 16 million is for maintaining. That's not improving or expanding.
No, there is an element of the expanding or improving, if you like. So 5-6 lines down on page 31, there is an estimate of theatre modernisation stroke refurb of 6.6 million. I think I said earlier in the introduction that actually came from a report 5-6 years ago.
What point is that?
So on 3.5,
Oh, right.
in at the top of page 31, the fifth on down is theatre modernisation stroke refurb at 6.6 million, for instance. Now, that was a study done back in 2015, 2016, somewhere back there, around how much it would cost to actually improve and modernise the current theatre provision, theatre itself. Now, that could be done at less, I'm guessing. It could be done at a lot more, I'm guessing as well. So that was taken from a report previously published. So
How old was that report?
it was 5-6 years ago.
Okay, so let's say substantially more then. Yeah. I visited the new office, the new offices very recently with Councillor Shinnick, and both of us were overwhelmingly impressed with the register space. It gives residents what they really deserve. The rose garden is going to be very beautiful. It gives them proper space and privacy for the families. It gives them much better facilities. That's what I want out of leisure and theatre and cultural provision. Something modern, something impressive, something grand. For me, it's very, very similar to the argument with Alsip Hospital. At times, sometimes you need to decide whether or not it's just a building and your sole function is just to maintain a building, or whether or not you want to try and create a better offering. Those are just my thoughts. I know they're contrary to Councillor Kent's thoughts and respect Councillor Kent's opinion. But the recommendation in front of us is to provide comment to the Cabinet. I dare say Sean will accurately report Councillor Kent's comments and other members' comments.
Right, okay.
Yeah, I'm just thinking that it is not just a decision, like whether we like to it or we don't like it. So it would be good to give the opportunity for that meeting to see the outcome, because at the end of the day, maybe it's important to carry the community along, whatever is going to happen to the inside, not just to think that this is what the councillors think, and then the cabinet is going to decide in December without putting everything together, to give opportunity for that meeting, for the outcome of the meeting, and so that we can be sure. Yeah, so that we can be sure. Sorry, I'm looking at. I was looking at.
No, that's it.
No, that's
Finish.
Yeah, so that we can be sure that the community are carried along with whatever decision is made.
I think, yeah, I mean, that's quite different from what Ms Byrne was talking about in terms of 3 or 4 meetings by the time we got there, and there would
We
be
were
2.
promised by Councillor Croxall that there would be 3 or 4 meetings. They'd probably be 2 weeks apart over a period of time. He said that it was his decision that in July that the Thames side would be closing, and he wanted the decision done by December. That's what he told the people that were present at that meeting.
Thank you, Ms. Byrne.
Could I possibly just make one really important point on what you said, if you wouldn't mind, please? It's really important.
You shouldn't really.
Okay,
It's
yeah, these figures that Sean's put here, and I'm quite surprised that they're the same figures, because they're figures that I saw back in July, August. And we actually, as the Save the Thames Side campaign, has an independent person have a look at these figures. What it doesn't say in this report is the original figures, which are exactly the same as the ones we saw back in August, are a 10-year forecast of maintenance that could be done over the big. It's not something that needs to be done in the next year. And I appreciate what you said, but this money doesn't need to be spent now. We could keep the Thames side open and invest in our future, as you both very, well said, that we need bigger. The people of Thurrock need bigger and better, and deserve bigger and better.
Thank you, Ms. Byrne. Okay.
So a few comments, Chair. First of all, Councillor Okanade. Yeah, I think I will make it as clear as I can from this committee exactly the feedback and concerns from Ms Byrne and from yourself and John, depending on what else happens with the vote. In addition, Councillor Coxshall and Councillor Hewlin will be at that meeting on the 30th of November. So although that won't be represented in the report because there won't be enough time to get it in the report, possibly could be if I'm adding it in.
That's what we say.
It's it might get it very late. But there will be the chance to make sure that's paid back, as I say, because there are the 2 relevant portfolio holders who should be at that round table meeting to be able to deal with that. Ms Byrne's quite right. I'm actually quite pleased that all of the figures are the same. That's a
Except for the
strength.
income, because as far as I was aware, the income would have been much more. Also, I do apologise.
The income would have been much more because that was including theatre income. This is about the complex itself and not including the services within it. And so, yeah, it's true. This is a 10-year programme. The majority of that is in the 5 years. I think just for the size of the table, because it's quite a large landscape table, I've put it in and I've talked about it being short to medium term. That's required over, but yeah, that's 10 years to be able to do all that. Some of that is quite urgent, and I'll go back to my point earlier about £300,000 being spent over the last 10 years on that complex. I think I've just covered all those points.
Okay, there's no more questions. So going back to recommendations 1.1, that the corporate overview scrutiny comment on the report for consideration by Cabinet at their meeting on the 8th of December 2021. I think more or less, I think we're all in agreement that Sean will be adequately, we're not, Sean, you're not, you're not convinced that Sean's going to do a good job at representing all what's been said here tonight and making sure Cabinet is actually well aware of it all.
No, Chair, I'm not. I want to move an additional recommendation 1.2, which is in relation to paragraph 3.6.2.
Hang on, can you go a bit slower? 1.2.
So, paragraph 3.6.2, we are told discussions are underway with interested parties on the potential for community asset transfer of potential conflict. I want to move recommendation 1.2 that asks or recommends that Cabinet give adequate time for those discussions to conclusion. They shouldn't rush to make a decision and closure of the same side, even if that means that we don't get a full decision.
I'm obviously not in favour of that. The simple reason that there is going to be a meeting on the 30th. I want it to be an honest dialogue between the community and the relevant cabinet members. And I think the committee is trying to prejudge too many things. An outcome could very well come out of that meeting between the community and the cabinet members. I'm not going to start prejudging it by starting to put stipulations on the recommendations.
You can vote against it.
I will.
Yeah, Buckley, what would you like to say?
Yeah, I mean, I like to agree with what John said because it's the most recent thing. And if there is discussion, you don't just decide the age, regardless of from the outcome. So we're waiting for the outcome. I think we should say that. We should have that as an addition. No. What I'm saying is that we should have that as an additional recommendation. That is, that is reasonable to just have an additional recommendation.
But
that states that it states that the cabinet should stay in action on the decision until the outcome of the.
I think what this recommendation 101 made all these that will be taken beforehand so that they can be satisfied that they are going to have meetings prior to that. Be okay to be able to forward with that. So, who is in agreement and who is against on 1.1 that the corporate overview of Scrutiny Committee, which is us, comment on the report, which is done, consideration by Cabinet at their meeting the 8th of December 2002. 201. 2021. Who is in agreement?
I think we agreed to that. Just saying additional.
Right, well that is it. So firstly, are we all in agreement with that? Yes. Right. Who is in agreement with putting forward additional agreement recommendation that Councillor Kent had suggested that regardless of the budgets, etc., that get it finished by the end of the year, that we wait longer, which I can't quite see because it will be there at the time. So
I'm sorry, Chair, it won't all be there. If, for instance, there is the basis of an agreement hammered out when the two sides meet, still need to be legal work of all sorts that just wouldn't be finished by the following week. That kind of stuff takes a long time. We all know that. We all know that.
And you know full well, as someone who's the leader of the council, that a cabinet member can amend their report on the night if they want to. A cabinet member can put on the night if they want to. Yeah. Let's be frank. There's just a degree of understanding here.
I put forward I would like to vote.
right, so we're going to vote on whether we have another proposal or not.
We've got the other proposal in a second. We're just voting now whether it's
Excuse me, John. I'm chairing this meeting, and for my purposes, I want to get the wording correct. So we've agreed 101 totally. I'm asking you to agree, will we have a session to Cabinet? Are we in agreement with not, or are we in So 2, 4. Yes, and I've got 3 against. So I think unfortunately I'll be going forward.
I mean, obviously, for the purpose of the minutes, it will be
Yes.
minuted.
Yeah.
It will be,
Yeah.
it will be minuted.
Yeah.
But I do think we have to push through. Yeah, we do have to push things through. Okay. Sorry, it's okay. Councillor Churchman has a bit of problems with his legs, so he's just going to have a stretch. Okay, right. The next item on our agenda is item 7. Local council tax room. This report's by Andy Britton. I'm getting very concerned about the time. It's 8:30 already, and the building actually closes at 9:30. So therefore, I think we can read quite well with us. So if you could make your presentation reasonably quick.
Sorry, Councillor, are you happy for residents to go if they're
All right.
if they're happy
Sorry,
to?
yes. Do people want to go or do you want to stay?
I'm quite happy to stay.
Yeah, that's okay. How about you? Quite interesting meeting, isn't it? They always are, so please to stay.
I'm happy to stay for a bit longer.
Thank you.
Okay, as long as you don't go interrupted between one particular bit where we're all speaking or discussing. Right, thank you. So this is the local council taxing. So over to you, Andy.
Thank you, Chair. Good evening, everyone. I'll try and get the introduction brief. So the report sets out the council's obligation to consider its council tax support scheme for working age people annually. The information included within the report supports members in considering the main recommendation that the scheme for working age people remains unchanged for the forthcoming financial year to enable ongoing means-tested assessment process, which currently drives high collection rates and low complaints. Additionally, the recommendation has been made in view of ongoing difficulties lower income households may face following the pandemic, providing consistency by maintaining current levels of support. Again, however, the council is required to consider its scheme annually, and therefore, if the recommendation is supported, the scheme will be further considered in future years when hopefully the situation is stabilised, future demand and support can be more competently assessed. Happy to take any questions.
Well, my thoughts are it seems to be working very well as it is, so why break it if it's not necessary? Are there any risks associated with continuing for another year?
I think the risks remain the same as always, it really, but more so this year in relation to the uncertainty in relation to future demand. The cost of the scheme will rise if claimant numbers significantly increase. However, I believe maintaining the current scheme is a better option until the situation is stabilised and a more accurate, competent forecast can be produced.
Thank you, Andy. Does anyone want to ask any questions?
Just a clarification.
Yes, okay.
Yeah, on page 37 and the second to the last paragraph on 33.2, that is the roller of universal credit. Is it a caseload or delay or something there? Is that affecting people that are claiming the LCTS?
No, there's no identified impact that you see on the LCTS claiming folks at this moment in time. Indeed, when people submit a claim for universal credit, if they tick the options they would also like to claim LCTS, it comes straight to us. We consider that a claim.
Oh, right, because I saw that caseload of 10,000 of these 4,000 claims for people.
Yeah,
does it affect
it's
anybody?
just giving you a breakdown between those on housing benefit, the legacy benefit, and those that are on the new universal credit.
Oh, right, okay, so thank you.
Not a question, it's a comment, Andy. The debt collection team frequently get a pretty appalling rap for nastiness, etc. Very recently, I had to contact the team regarding a constituent who had a number of problems. I think the team was incredibly courteous and compassionate and very, very supportive. So I just wanted to put on record how well I think the team really do at times in terms of supporting people, especially people who are vulnerable. So if you could pass on
Thank you,
those thanks to the
Councillor.
team.
I will certainly pass that to the team.
Is there any other questions? No. So, recommendation 1.1, to note the elements of the current scheme. Point 2, to support a recommendation that the current scheme remains unchanged for 2022 to 2023. We all agree.
Agreed.
Thank you. Thank you. Right, moving on to item 8. It's the corporate performance report 2021 to 2022. Right, I think this is going to be, yes. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. So this is the mid-year or quarter 2 performance report. In this obviously incorporates April to June, the first quarter, where we were still in elements of lockdown, and then moving in July, August, and September, so where we were moving out of lockdown, albeit so everyone's aware that obviously were still some impacts moving forward. Having said that, the report shows that 71% of those indicators within the corporate scorecard at the end of September, so halfway through the year, were achieving targets, and 60% were better than the previous year. Questions that the committee asked in the December meeting that I wasn't able to answer, I've incorporated into section 3.6 on here, and I think with that just move over to the board.
Okay.
Just want to say well done on the target that we made, you know, and then also some that's improved. I got
What page number?
yes, I'm looking at page 48, where 48,
Yeah.
and the indication for proportion of older people still at home 91 days after discharge from hospital. I probably do not understand this, but if the reason for the failure there says that, I'll just read it. I just wanted to go on the 4th line. Of the 13 not at home, 8 had passed away, and 5 were in hospital. So the question is that it's a bit contradictory to me, because if they were in hospital and we're talking about the discharge from the hospital, and why are you calculating the fact that still in hospital? Shouldn't that be part of?
Yes, so my understanding on this indicator is that 91 days, 3 months later, it could be that those individuals have gone back into hospital, they've been readmitted. So that's where those would be, where it's more complex cases. That is my understanding of that. And it's a nationally set indicator in the way it's measured. But yeah, that's my understanding of those 5 that were in hospital. So they've gone back into hospital, not necessarily for the same reason they were in the first place.
Yeah, and sometimes I think, well, it's because people are discharged or they're waiting for the cut-off period, which is always midday, on when figures are calculated on the 91 days, and if not taken out of hospital and given care in home, that always goes back to being 1. Sorry, you wanted to say?
Yeah, you just another one, and it's probably just like a comment. It's page 51, and it's to do with the turnaround relays of voice. I mean, we do have homelessness, and it's really not good enough that we having a problem with the number of days that it takes us to turn around a property to be relate to the needing person. But saying that, I saw also that there are a problem with sheltered accommodation that is upstairs. So I wanted to sort of ask, or maybe you can sort of take this point away, in terms of like, what other incentives are you using to get people to be able to take, I mean, obviously considering their needs, because they may not be able to climb up or something, but if they were able to climb up, what other incentives, I mean, you should be considering other incentives, and just not necessarily say you're going to wait and check what other local authorities are doing, but obviously in terms of maybe rent differentiation or something, you know, are you considering something that, because we cannot really be failing on this. There's a lot of people having you know, homelessness problem in Thurrock that we should be failing on relax.
I'm looking at Lucy because Evelina's joining on online. I can see her there. Evelina, did you hear the question?
Yes, I did. I don't think I got the full question, but I think I got the gist. Good evening, good evening, Chair. So I've got difficulties hearing, especially at the back of the room, but I'll try. So I think the question was about sheltered housing and the turnaround, void letting time and all that. So I think the point about us checking with others is exactly to see what others are doing in order to incentivize or change the criteria to get people to actually bid for those properties and to ensure that the properties are suitable for them. We have done a lot of analysis of the data, and it really points out to the void properties that are in sheltered housing complexes and are located on the first floor. For those that are aware, our sheltered housing is age restricted, and it's got sort of certain other criteria that one needs to meet. So what we are looking at is lowering that criteria, having sensitive lets to ensure that obviously the community can live sort of well together, that no one is disturbed, but that we also let it fairly. It should, the sort of indications are telling us that we have dealt with the most difficult to let properties now, and these are the ones that have not been let for quite a number of weeks. So going forward, we think that the statistics will look better, but as I say, we're still looking at what we can do to make it easier for those individuals to bid for the properties and accept them, and what other groups we can let into the sheltered housing schemes, so that our communities can live together well within sheltered housing.
Yes, that's lovely. Any more questions? Councillor Howard.
I'm very concerned about the failed target on page 53, the children in care. After 28 days, all children need to have an initial health assessment after 28 days in care to make sure they're fit and healthy. We've dropped from 85% down to 61%. There are two reasons cited. One, where the family haven't given consent, where frankly, obviously we can work with the family, but we can't mandate consent. But the other reason given is that the request hadn't been made for that health assessment to health colleagues. I mean, those are two totally different issues. If the child or family isn't giving consent, obviously that's difficult, we have to work with them. But if we had failed to simply ask health colleagues to conduct a health assessment of a looked after child, that's quite unacceptable. That's a failure on our part, and not something that was insurmountable, like denied consent. So as far as I'm asking, why are those two explanations being conflated? And is it just like one example of consent being denied and 90 examples of us not asking health colleagues? What is the breakdown there?
I'm going to have to say I do not know. This isn't an area of my specialism. So if you're happy for me to go back and ask the children's colleagues there, and I'll provide you an answer to that. Other than what's on there, I don't have any further clarification.
No, I think also we need clarification. I know that some children, you can see you're going to have an assessment and they'll go no. So So actually, it's really hard we need to look at. Give us an answer back.
Perhaps if we can have a written answer, because the thing that concerns me a lot about this is that it was only a couple of years ago we had an appalling record within the health service of making sure that young people living with learning disabilities were having their health checks. At one stage, I think we were as low as 9% of young adults with learning difficulties having health checks. A huge amount of work has been done to claw us back from that position, and we're in a much better position now. I don't want to see us falling back with health checks in other areas, especially if there is a divide between consent and just getting the health service mechanisms in place. One is a problem that might take time to overcome. One is simply unacceptable.
And also, I'm wondering of the impact of COVID on that, you know, with the GPs to comment on the building stuff assessments as well. Okay, any other questions?
Yeah, just very briefly, I'm grateful for the clarifications on page 57 to issues that you raised in the past. Thanks for that. It's just worth noting that in the whole calendar year, this authority only permitted extraordinarily low, especially when you think against some of the comment that we can see from delivering assessment. And on page 54, penalty notices, which we raised time and again, it's now just about 1 in 2 fixed penalty notices actually being paid. I still don't see any real action plan to get us to a position where it's kind of more than optional to pay it. We see in the commentary that you can go back 2 years, 3 years. It's seldom been anywhere, and I would like to see some sort of clear position there.
Oh, totally agree.
I'll feed that back to the.
Who oversees the collection of FPNs? Is that Kingdom as a contractor, or is that our own service?
Yeah, through your chair, I believe it is a mix. It's linked in with Kingdom, but certainly I'm looking at Andy actually. It doesn't go through somebody. It doesn't go through somebody that so it's going to be largely Kingdom. Largely Kingdom.
Right, so any other questions on this item? No? So the recommendations on page 43, 1.1, to note and comment upon the performance of the key performance indicators, in particular those areas which are off target and the impact of COVID-19. And 1.2, to identify any areas which require additional consideration. All in agreement with that? Yeah, agreed. Okay, it's lovely. Now we are on item 9 on page 61, and this is an update on the fair debt update that we had at the last committee meeting. And though Councillor Head gave his apologies, I do see he has actually sneaked in. We want to invite him on. I'm going to comment firstly on 1.4, because I think that is a really good recommendation. That those who cannot pay, we do not increase their, increase their stress levels on it. But those who can pay, do pay, and I think that is. Anyway, so if Andy, if you would like to introduce this.
Thank you, Chair. So the report before you provides an update on enhancements and initiatives that have been delivered within the debt recovery services following the external review in 2017 and the Fair Debt Summit that was held in 2018. Right from the outset, I want to stress that this piece of work is ongoing. However, whilst much of the development work was paused last year to allow delivery of COVID financial support initiatives, I believe we've made good progress. Again though, we are very much on an ongoing journey and the service will continue to enhance and evolve. The initiatives covered within the report are a single view of data, which has brought together information from multiple systems on amounts owing to the council and provide an indication on potential vulnerability. Financial inclusion, which provides additional dedicated support by an officer to people in extreme circumstances to ensure they can access the relevant support available. Introduction of the breathing space legislation, which provides a pause and recovery action to enable organisations assisting people with their finances time to identify a resolution, and the focus on early resolution through delivery of effective communications, delivering the right message in the right way at the right time. The report also provides a summary how the service tailored its approach to provide additional support to residents and businesses throughout the pandemic whilst maintaining high collection rates. Finally, included is the draft revised fair debt policy, which has been developed in collaboration with summit attendees and supports an enhanced approach to ensure those that can't pay are assisted in gaining appropriate support, and those that deliberately avoid payment are brought to justice using all legislative means available. Thank you, Chair. Any questions?
Thank you, Andy. Just a quick question. How do you, or how easy are you able to differentiate between the two categories of people? Those who can't, yeah, you know what I mean?
Those who run.
Yeah, those who want and those who can't.
So as it stands at the moment, we're very much reliant on
Have you ever
people
got it wrong?
contacting us to
Okay.
tell us the problems they're experiencing.
Yeah.
The next phase of single view of data, which I've seen a beta version of, is very exciting, and it pulls together all the information, including external sources, with more indication of the person's ability to pay, propensity to pay, etc. That is when we can start using the data to drive more intelligent intervention approaches, so that someone on a low income that's falling into debt, rather than getting a debt letter saying you can't pay up or we're going to take it to court, is directed to claim the benefits they're entitled to. That sort of thing.
Have you got any more comments? Any more questions?
Thanks, Andy. I think this is absolutely a fabulous piece of work. It's been running on for a couple of years now. I know Council Head launched a few years ago, how we can provide better financial information to young people, help them avoid debt, to help them avoid some of the pitfalls, and frankly go after the offenders with tremendous compassion for those who are genuinely in difficulty. So I'm hugely encouraged by this work. On the tackling those who can and won't pay, you've listed there's close to £1 million associated to debtors who've got multiple liability orders against them.
Excuse me, James, what page?
So that's page 65, 5.2.
Okay, right.
So can you explain what is the breakdown of that £1 million? Are we talking 1,000 small offenders? We're talking 10 very big offenders?
It's
I'm trying to get a
approximately
sense of
200 people
200 people.
within that.
So 200 people are in £1 million combined. So I'm going to go ahead and assume that considering you've said that we've exhausted all other collection channels, some of these debts have been outstanding for a while.
Yes.
So what is the enforcement plan going forward if more traditional methods?
So the enforcement plan going forward is to open up the means inquiry process through the magistrates' court. So basically, we will summons a debtor to appear in court. The magistrate will perform a means inquiry. If they're found to have willfully refused to pay council tax, then they can be committed to prison for a period of 60 days as the ultimate sanction.
And we've got the capacity to do this, have we?
We're building the capacity to do that.
Oh, brilliant. I was hoping officers that are paying for themselves, essentially.
Absolutely. So within the business case we put forward, and we're recruiting one temporary member of staff and a temporary on a fixed term contract for 1 year. The business case we put forward is approximately looking at 20% out of £1 million. So yes.
My other point was you referenced the Zentura case mapping system. I know lots of parts of the council use it. I certainly remember when I was cabinet member for Children's Services, the public health team were getting very excited at looking at how we could map young people who we think are at risk of becoming involved with gangs. So multiple data tranches from truancy to ASB and bits and pieces. How's the department finding using that big data to come to your conclusions about providing people breathing space? Because I guess it is a complicated beast with so many moving parts, and corralling that data was not easy.
So breathing space at the moment, it's more about the support of organisations coming to us, such as Citizens Advice, Christians Against Poverty, etc., and saying we're helping this individual, will you put the account on hold? That's what breathing space is about. So someone asking that. But I think the bigger picture you're talking about is the single view of debt where Zanjura are delivering with us. So phase 1, which is delivered, was about creating the single view, drawing information from 4 systems together with a view of vulnerability. The second phase, which we're about to enter into, is the more exciting phase, where it looks around how we use all this wonderful information that Zanjura have mined for us in order to drive collection strategies, intervention strategies, etc.
So are you working with the, for example, with the public health team who, what I'm trying to get to in terms of the single point of debt is, single view of debt, is lots of departments are trying to use this technology to triangulate residents who we believe are vulnerable or could lead themselves into that. The public health team did an exercise when they looked at this with the gang issue, and some of the early attempts were not covered in glory. It took a lot of refinement to make it work. So are you actually working with the public health team to try and bring in data that isn't perhaps just financially related, but could indicate someone will end up defaulting on their bills?
So that data set is part of single view of debt. When we get onto the intervention strategies going forward, it will not only look at what's the right message to send, but also the right person to deliver it. So, for example, if it is troubled families, etc., if we've got a family in debt, it's probably better we alert someone in troubled families rather than sending a letter, which may make the situation worse. So it is a growing piece. Yes, that data set is included, but more how we use that data and what strategies that supports is within the next phase.
I was thinking specifically in terms of like the adult social care team. If you've got someone, if you've got an adult with learning disabilities on personal direct payments, if they suddenly fall out of their personal direct payments, it's quite unlikely that they've suddenly become independently wealthy.
Yeah.
It's more likely that something unfortunate has happened. They've fallen out of that, and that consequently means they're probably going to default on something to the council. So clearly there needs to be some type of flag on the system that allows us to intervene before they default, just to say, we know you have direct help with your payments. Your circumstances have just changed. That system's flagged. Are you okay? Is there something that
Absolutely. And the current system we used historically is not intelligent. It doesn't do that. It will send out a letter based on the debt. What single view of debt aims to do is to send the right communication or get the right person involved based on the person's circumstances, not just the debt.
Okay, thank you, Andy. I'm going to take questions from Councillor Kent, and then I'm going to, as we've got the opportunity of having a photo holder here,
So just 2 things. One is that, as I've said before, I really do welcome this. I particularly welcome the early intervention and getting good financial schools. As we discussed before, there are a number of organisations amongst them, banks like NetWest, that really good tailored programs that schools, and it's authority to impose, but I would hope that in conversation with schools we can encourage, especially primaries, to take up that offer and opportunity. I just look at Appendix 1 on page 91, where we talk about the vulnerable persons policy, and I've got two questions for Andy. One is, how does this differ, if it does, from our existing policy? And the second is, somebody has been identified as vulnerable, so they're not being pursued. That doesn't mean that the debt dies. What's the kind and the considerate approach to actually getting the debt settled? That's not quite clear.
Right, so the vulnerable persons policy in relation to debt is very much in relation to debt. It's how we consider someone's, are they impacted by their vulnerability in paying their account, and that's what this vulnerable persons policy aims to do in relation to. The approach we take is very much dependent on the information we receive, whether that's through a discussion with the person that owes money in the situation they present, to determine the course of action, which could be a payment arrangement, a referral to existing advice, another internal council service. So it's a case by case basis, determine the approach that we would take.
Yeah, I mean, give me an example of how we would work with a vulnerable person to get the debt settled.
So it could be, for example, so I've mentioned the inclusion service. Now, if we identified someone that was vulnerable to the extent that signposting to a service such as citizen advice wasn't suitable for them, then the financial inclusion officer would act as a conduit between that person's citizen advice, the professional organisation, depending on what help we believe they needed. To retain that support.
Thanks.
Councillor Head.
Thank
To say anything?
Thank you, Chair. And like I said last time to the committee, I appreciate you giving this the rigour and the authentic look at what we're trying to do. This is a subject which, you know, you probably have the board hear me saying. This is something that's very dear to me. I think we've probably all got moments in our life where we can look back and worry about household debts at a point, wondering how we were going to deal with it. We've all been there. And this whole effort, this whole piece of work is designed to try and help people who, frankly, do want to pay, but just simply find they can't. And I just begin into that conversation around vulnerability. So when we did the Fair Debt Summit in 2018, we invited a number of external groups and representatives. So the IRB, but also a gentleman called John Cruz, who has practiced collection law on both sides. I think it's probably the loosest way of putting that. And that was one of the real things that struck out at me, was that whole piece about how do we define and create sensitive approaches to people that we identify or that do identify with vulnerability. And that's why a lot of effort went into that. So I'm glad that conversation happened. And like Andy said, I think it's quite an organic approach in terms of how we handle those cases. But the spirit behind it is obviously having that vulnerability definition. We talked about education last time, talked about how we can support people moving forward. I think single view of debt is going back to the point I raised about household debts, and everyone's probably all had them. Rather than having 5 letters and 5 problems, now it can kind of become one holistic problem. And that is a much different problem to confront if you're dealing with a problem, rather than multiple problems with different agencies, different people, different discussions, different meetings, different time commitments. That is a much different situation to hopefully what single view of debt can achieve, which obviously benefits everybody in the long run. I think Councillor Canardi made quite an important, or asked quite an important question. Where is the line of differentiation between those who can pay but won't, and those who can't pay but want to? I think, and do correct me if I'm wrong here, but if I understand it correctly, I think 20% of the debt book is carried by about 5% of debtors prudently through the debt book, which is quite a significant number if you think about that. So 5% of debtors carry a fifth of the outstanding debt. We are not talking about someone who's a month out. We're talking about habitual, routine, consistent people who are not making payment that process would seek to go after, because for all the taxation that community aren't paying, respectfully, that's devoiding the authority of being able to deliver what everybody else is paying for, and creates a pressure. And those that are paying and want to pay, you should be doing the right thing by those that are evading taxation, obviously the essential public services that we provide. So I'll obviously have to take any questions on this in particular. Lovely discussion to watch.
No, I don't think so. So, recommendations are recommendation 1.1 to note the initiatives delivered since the Fair Debt Summit. 1.2 to review and comment on the performance. 1.3 to review and comment on the draft revised fair debt policy. 1.4 to endorse that the council uses all its legal powers available to it to recover money owed by those people who can pay but weren't due. Are we all in agreement? Great. Thank you. Right, moving on to our last item this evening on our agenda. Very aware of the time, as I said. Agenda item 10, bit of a good news story, and Lucy, this is over to you, and this is Thurrock's Scrutiny review and update. Thank you, Lucy.
You're welcome. Yeah, I won't take too long, just providing the introduction. So it just provides an update to the scrutiny review, which was agreed at the end of last year by this committee and by Cabinet. It just kind of details how we've implemented some of the recommendations. So there were 10 recommendations that were agreed, and it goes into detail in the report. Obviously, this is an ongoing piece of work, and these kind of changes, cultural changes, do take time. As I've outlined in the report, some committees have really taken on board some of the recommendations, and some committees have taken on board others, and that was always going to be the nature of the review. There's still some more work to do on some of the recommendations, and we'll be doing that ongoing throughout the rest of the municipal year and into the next municipal year. And I'm happy to take any questions.
So, thank you, Lucy. Recommendation 1.1, the Corporate Overview and Scrutiny Committee comment on the implementation of the review recommendations thus so far, as outlined in Appendix 1. Right, going on to our future work programme. And there is something I want to add to this, and that is on our next one in January. I am going to invite Councillor Coxwell to give us some updates on his portfolio holding. So I think that would be okay. Are you all in agreement with me doing that? Yeah. Is there anything one want to add anything else? Actually, as I say, we've got the debt summit, so in March I would like Councillor Head, if you're available, to attend that one. Okay, that is it. So the time now is 9:05, so I'll be looking to close the meeting. And again, I'd like to thank officers for the input tonight and all their reports. Thank the committee for turning out tonight, and wish you all a safe journey.